Hello.
Maybe at the moment, summertime joy of cricket always, and maybe seen as a quieter time for the arts apart from the big festivals. And they're on their way, and we already had Glastonbury Festival. But that's not to say that there aren't the pleasures still. And you spent last weekend steeped in Beatles history at two events, but almost by accident. I thought you were definitely planning one. When you mentioned by accident, what's happened
Well,
there?
well, I was. Well, on the Sunday, I was off with a few friends to the Lowry in Manchester in Media City to see
Hmm.
the world-renowned Beatles expert and author Mark Lewson talking about the year 1963 in the context of the Beatles with Stuart Maconie, the BBC Six Music DJ and also broadcaster and also successful published author, talking
Yes.
for. I thought it was going to be an hour, but it was like actually more than 2.25 hours of
That's in the great
1963
tradition of
facts.
Lewisohn taking forever to write his books.
Exactly, yeah. But what I didn't know is that when I went to an exhibition in Harrogate on the Saturday the day before at
Mm,
108 Fine Art in Colbath Road, run by the Stewarts, the family of the late Andrew Stewart, I didn't
yeah.
know that at the exhibition was going to be Dudley Edwards. And of course, Dudley Edwards, apart from being a great artist and a part of the design team in the 1960s called BEV, well,
Mm.
Dudley Edwards also, he painted Paul McCartney's Magic Piano that he still uses on
He
tour.
still uses on stage.
He
Yeah.
he was a co-creator of the event at the Roundhouse in January 1967 in London that Paul McCartney did music for with the Beatles called Carnival Light.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was also he painted Tara Brown's car, and Tara Brown was the I think was he the son of Guinness, and he had a
Yes.
terrible car crash in '66, and he
Yeah.
knew John and Paul, and so A Day in the Life was partly inspired by Tara Brown's crash,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
wasn't the car that Dudley Edwards had painted, but he did paint one of his cars, and he did know
Mm,
Tara Brown. And he also
mm.
lived with Paul McCartney for 4 months at the time of the recording of Sergeant Pepper's. So he was in
Oh, gosh.
Abbey Road Studios. He was there the night that Paul McCartney first met Linda McCartney in the Bag o' Nails Club in London, and he
Mm.
went back with him to someone's house for more drinks. He lived in Ringo's house for 2 months in '67. So, so Dudley Edwards was really embedded with the Beatles for a
Yeah.
really exciting 7 months. So he was telling me on the Saturday about, well, I won't mention the drugs, but he was telling
Just
me
have,
that the
Graham. You
Beatles,
just have.
yeah, yeah, the Beatles in '67 would receive fan mail from female fans, some of which included nude photographs of said fans offering themselves to the Beatles. I'm not sure that Mark Lewson's, I'm not sure Mark Lewson right about that. I suppose he has to, because he's quite a factual based man, but it was still
Yeah.
slightly shocking to hear it. So that was my Beatles experience on the Saturday, followed by the real life Beatles experience in Manchester on the Sunday.
So I think he's still writing the early days book, isn't he? So does,
Well, it's
it's
volume two, so
63
it's
when this
60.
first book's supposed to finish.
Yeah, it's January '63, and I think it's to '66 or maybe '67, the next volume. But he's been doing it now for 10 years or more. So
Exactly.
he himself now jokes on stage about how long it's taken to write volume two.
I mean, I take, I understand the absolute method. If Methodicism is a word, and it might not be, but there is such a word as Catholicism. So I'm going with method anyway. Surely, I would have thought Mark has to slightly consider, and this sounds a bit grim, but the trail of the Grim Reaper. He needs to crack on with it, really. So I'm just wondering if he
Yeah.
really needs to do it in quite the depth he is.
Well, he's a detailed man. He's a fact man. He's not a like wiffle waffle opinions, speculation, hyperbole, and theory man. He lives or dies by knowing what he's talking about. And there's so many aspects of the Beatles' history between '63 and '67. I mean, that's
Yes.
the first book was massive, absolutely massive.
Mm.
But this book's got much more to actually dwell on because the first volume, the Beatles are only released really one or two records by the time you came to the end of the book. This time round,
Mm.
you've got so many albums, so many tours, so many live shows, so many developments in their private lives. It's just, and he likes to research the people involved with the Beatles, so it won't just be about the Beatles, but it'll be the impact on family members and George Martin, Brian Epstein. Well, he's basically writing about 20 books in one book. So I can understand why the Mark Lewisohn approach does lead to this length of time, because he's not a half measures man.
No.
But quite funnily, at the actual event, and Stuart McConney was quite entertaining, but
Yeah.
Mark was talking about, he showed film clips as well as the chat, and he
Mm.
showed a clip of John Lennon and the Beatles in late-ish 1963 on national TV, and the interviewer saying to John Lennon, and Ted Heath, the Conservative politician, has criticised the Beatles for the lack of good English. And John replies on national television, "Oh, I say, I can't understand what Ted's saying. We speak perfectly good English." And then he turns to the camera and says in his proper Scouse voice, "We're not voting for you, Ted." And it's like such a
That's fun.
ballsy moment. And
Yeah.
this is when the Beatles were mop tops, loved by everybody.
Yeah.
There's still a certain edge to the Beatles, even when they were in their most lovable phase.
Always. I mean, that could never be. You might have management trying to smooth things and not have that, but inevitably, Lennon in particular, the character was going to come through.
Well, the difference between Lennon and the rest is they all agreed with that sentiment, but Paul would have sort of like got round the question by raising his eyebrows, and you'd be able to tell that Paul wasn't happy with Ted, but he wouldn't have said
Yeah.
it. George would have said he was unhappy with Ted, but he would have said it in a much more matter of fact, sort of like obtusely witty fashion. Ringo would have just laughed at the whole idea and not answered the question because he wouldn't have been interested. So they were all on the same wavelength, but they're a different way of expressing themselves.
What kind of an audience now goes to a Beatles event like that? Are we talking your kind of age? Are we talking older? Are we talking younger as well? I mean, this is the most ubiquitous of all groups.
You're kind of decrepitude. You're kind of, I'm in the pension home waiting to have my food served through a straw age. Thank you very much. Well, it's a mixed bag. I'd say the average age of the audience at the Lowry Manchester last Sunday is probably late 50s, 60. So there's a few who were in their 70s. Then there was a few who were like late teens, early 20s. Then there was more who were in their 40s. But overall, yeah, there's quite a few people in the 60s there. And it did make me think, if Mark doesn't finish his whole series of books, in good time, his audience may die as well.
And that's kind of what I'm hinting. But then, as you've said, he's just not going to compromise on that thought.
No, he can't, because his reputation is
if
built
he's a
on.
detail man, he can't.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
In that time, I mean, so Hunter Davis would do his guidebook to the Beatles, done, dusted. I just wonder why Mark's taken it to the level that he has.
Because when he first made his name in the 1980s, and the first book he published was The Beatles Live, and that came out in 86, and that was the first Beatles book that actually got the facts down in paper about every single live gig the Beatles played. Up until then, it was all like half-truths, some facts, some inaccuracies, speculation. And so until Mark Lewisohn, all Beatles writers basically told the same story with the same supposed facts to the same outcome. And he from the very beginning wanted to establish exactly what actually happened before he said anything else. And no previous Beatles writer had bothered to do that. They were all happy to like tell the broad story with a lot of the same anecdotes, a lot of the same facts or inaccuracies. It's just what happened. But he was against that from the very beginning, so he can't go back in that. He's got no room to turn into.
Well, we look forward to his next talk that you're attending in about 15 years' time. That'll be splendid.
Well, no, this is the third time I've seen him in 2 years, because he's basically spent his advance already on the book.
Well, there's his problem, Graham.
Raising money. He's raising money by touring. Like he was a band.
Right. Well, there's his problem. He's not getting on with the book. Mark, get on with the book. Stop trying to raise the money to keep you actually living.
Yeah, but it's catch-22. He needs to tour to raise the money to write the book.
He'll be more than 64, presumably.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, I'll be there soon. So, Graham, long threatened, and we have already partly discussed the book by Sunil Kilnani, but this is an angle on it that I think is interesting. And this is India in 50 Lives, a book that you've been reading in depth and just given us little glimpses throughout. And I should say it's actually called Incarnations, India in 50 Lives. Now, the question here is what it says about British imperial tactics and modern India. a light topic brackets, as you say, which of course it isn't, but there's no reason just to have lightweight topics on this podcast, such as the history of the Beatles. So that's just the one main question there then. What does it say about imperial? And it's interesting you use the word tactics. Tactics.
Yeah,
Why
well,
do you choose the word tactics?
because there's an idea that the Beatles, Britain and the Beatles are sort of linked in my head. There's an idea
And
that
India,
Britain
Graham, they're
and
linked with India.
yeah, yes, true. There's an idea that the British have a general approach to things based on the idea of fair play and common sense and good behavior. But
Sounds like Johnny
people
Best
in
all over
power,
again.
people in power are a bit more cynical than that, and they tend to know what they're doing.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
not
yeah.
like sort of like out there to live lives of moral correctness
No.
and be saintly. They just aren't. And so Sunil Kilnani, who is a great writer and a famous writer and Indian and knows a
Mm.
hell of more about Indians than I do, absolutely amazingly brilliant book. He says that there is no agreed definition of what India is in terms of either the boundaries or the religion or the culture. And he says that's part of the reason you've still got the divisions you've got now. But the British, when they were in charge, gleefully played each side off against each other, even within individual states. The British always divide and rule. That's how they managed to rule. They divided. They'd
Mm.
reward some people at the expense of other people, and they wouldn't be consistent in that. Whatever worked at any one point in terms of dividing and rule, that's what they do. They wouldn't like have one system. It was very flexible. And at one point, they gave uh, India the vote about 1910 for the first time, but they only gave 10% of the population the vote. A typical British approach, divide and rule from the beginning. But then
Mm.
when they did that, they also split the country up into obviously electoral divisions. But they divided electorates by religious group and ethnic group, thus dividing and ruling, another few times. So they're always out from the start. But it's not as if the British created that. They found a country that wasn't a country and they exploited the divisions for their own good. And Sunil Kilnani makes no attempt to blame the British for the whole situation because since he knows his stuff, he doesn't resort to such simplicities. He explains the whole thing without fear or favour to any side, whether that's an Indian side or a British side. That's why it's such a great book. He's not attempting to look for someone to blame. He's trying to explain what happened and why it happened and why India today is the way it is.
So, is the conclusion in all this ultimately that Britain's influence on India overall has been a bad thing? That India would have been better off if the British had never taken control of India? Or
No, he
actually,
doesn't do that
amongst
because
those
that
50
means
lives that are featured, is there something to be
hmm,
said for what Britain is perceived to have brought to India?
no, there's no such easy, you know, chart of pros and cons to British rule India. He wouldn't do that because that's really simplistic. And he
Yes.
shows that even to this day that there's been, I mean, even the main figures in the story of India becoming independent, Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah, they were all heavily influenced by the British. In fact, most of them were educated either in British-run schools in India, or more likely they actually went to England itself and actually had their education in England. So they came back and took what they learned and used it. So, for example, one of Nehru's great advisors, Krishna Menon, in the 1950s, and he was his closest advisor in government about foreign policy and national affairs. And he was partly responsible for developing India's non-alignment policy, where they were neither for Russia nor against it. They were neither on the Russian side during the Cold War, neither were they on the West side, the NATO side. So he helped create that sort of independent policy. But Menon himself, he'd been educated in England, and he'd spent a long time living in England in the 30s. And in the
Yeah.
1930s, and this is one of the great things about the book, because it's not opinions, it's all facts, but facts used to show a point. And in the 30s, he and editor Alan Lane actually created the Penguin and Pelican paperbacks. So the
Mm.
Great British Literary Institution of Penguin is part of the creation of an Indian person,
Mm.
which of course the British don't don't like to highlight very much because
No,
the British always think everything British is British. But of course, everything British isn't British.
no. Well, particularly now, most popular
Mm.
dish in
But
Britain
it never
is not
was.
British. It's not
It never
British.
was. Yeah, yeah. It never was though, Charles.
No, no. So your final thought on this book, which is, it's clearly fascinated you as a read, has it prompted you to want to return to India and
Not really,
experience?
but it makes me compare things between India and Britain. So we're politicians, the public, the equations, and there's a constant to and froing and battle to get ascendancy in one direction or the other. Well, that also applies to Britain if you think about it. The to and fro between Labour and the Tories and liberal politics and right-wing politics, the NHS and private enterprise, that just goes on forever, over and over and over again. And it's the
Mm,
same as India. We're different to India, but in a lot of ways, it's the same phenomenon happening. And so there's a great example of the book, and it goes back. This is in the late 70s, between 1973 and 1975. Then the economy had a big crisis, just like in the West when there was the oil crisis. And so then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who was supposedly a great parliamentarian,
yeah.
well, the book says that when parliamentary politics impeded the implementation of her own plans for economic stabilization, she began to think she could do without facing obstreperous and misguided parliamentarians. So, confident of her legitimacy after electoral success,
Mm,
she decided to take more state control in other areas of life. She began to embrace a Jacobin, or what the historian Patrick Clibbins called an authoritarian republican, a conception of political power in which a claim at the polls was thought to absolve leaders from the other forms of accountability. Now, who does that remind you of in Britain? You get a claim at the polls, you win the elections, you got public popularity, so that absolves you of any accountability, any other form of responsibility.
I can imagine you're
Seems a bit
referring
like
to Boris Johnson.
no, of course not. No. So how different are we? How different are they? It's all vaguely from the same, you know, pond of behaviour.
The political playbook of bad political play, but
Mm.
tactics that work, is pretty much the same the world over, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's just what happens is that different tactics are dominant at different times, but also
Yeah,
they're dominant to different strengths. So at some point it'll be lightweight right-wing politics, then it'll be hard right-wing politics. Then if you're really
yeah,
unlucky, countries like Turkey, for example, you have or Hungary, you'll have extreme
mm,
right-wing politics. So it's
yeah,
just a matter of wait. And in the 60s in Britain, when Labour were in power from 64 to 1970, you had the highest rate of taxation
yeah.
ever.
It did.
And
Yeah, yeah.
you didn't get it under Blair and you wouldn't get it under Stammer if
No,
he
no,
managed to win in the general
no.
election. So the weight of the ascendant ideas and politics changes from period to period as well.
Mm. But the principle of how to gain power does that change?
No, but it depends on how tough it is. So, for example, Cameron wasn't actually that popular as a prime minister.
No,
And his first term was a lot of talk that he was going to lose the general election in 2015, which he didn't
yeah,
do. But
no.
part of the reason that the Tory government has moved more to the right and into populist policies is because its moderate form wasn't actually that popular, mainly because the economy wasn't doing as brilliantly as everybody said it was. So that when they could feel the public moving away from them, that is when they became much more populist.
Absolutely, indeed. So, Graham, thank you for thoughts on India. Just going to draw your attention to an event that's coming up in London. It's called Dog Day Afternoon.
Ah, Al Pacino
Pre-
film.
Indeed, presented by Festival Republic. And this is not really just an afternoon by the looks of it, although they're old enough probably need to have their Horlicks in the evening. July the 1st at the Crystal Palace Park. And it's the ultimate punk celebration.
Oh,
Let's
really?
run through the bill. Let's run through the
Okay.
septuagenarian and sextuagenarian bill. Iggy
Yeah,
Pop,
yeah,
Blondie,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Generation Sex.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll come on to them in a second. Stiff Little
Mm,
Fingers, who probably have more than stiff little fingers now. They're probably stiff all over the place now.
exactly. Yeah,
Buzzcocks, who of
arthritic
course
fingers.
don't have Pete Shelley anymore, and a group that I wasn't familiar with, the Lambrini Girls, who apparently from
The
Brighton. They represent
Lambrini Girls. Never heard of them.
Lambrini Girls. They
Huh.
must be new apparently, compared with everyone else. And they're Brighton punks, and they sing the I'll never get this right, LBTQ
Oh
plus
yeah,
anthem,
yeah.
"Help Me, I'm Gay." Now,
Okay.
who is in the Generation Sex band, do you think?
Ah, that's hilarious. I know this already. It's like Generation X and the Sex Pistols came
Yeah,
together in bed and
it
produced
is.
a new
It
band.
is. So there's Billy Idol, Steve Jones, Tony James, and Paul Cook. And it got me thinking that actually, ultimately, this is what the bands are going to have to do. As people die off, they're going to do exactly this. You're going to get more bands like Generation Sex, where you bring bands together of the only people that are still alive to do it. If they're determined to keep
That's an
going
interesting
forever and
thought.
a day. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, that's what
So
they've
which
already
bands
started.
could we see? Which
Yeah.
bands could we see evolving from that scenario
Well, I quite like the idea of
as time
Smith
goes
and
on?
I quite like the idea of Smith and Jones. So you get Johnny Marr with any number of people called Jones. I
That's
think
true.
let's see
Yeah.
what happens with that. You know.
Mm.
So where do you stand on people who are getting ancient still performing? I mean, I don't want to be ageist about this, but were you really convinced at Glastonbury by Debbie Harry's performance, for example? Really?
Well, no, but as long as people pay the money to see it happen, it will happen. But if you think
But what
back
are
to
they
Miles
now, Graham?
Davis,
What are
yeah,
they
but
now
yeah, but
seeing? What are they now
yeah, but
seeing?
they're seeing themselves reflected in someone older, and they're both sets are wishing they were younger, and it was the same as it was in 1979 or 1982 or
Right.
whatever. It's
So is
clinging
that
on to your youth, but that's what
so is that
happens.
a
This is
negative
what
form
happens.
of nostalgia ultimately, Graham?
Not really. I mean, I remember like a long time ago when BBC Radio 2 would have big band music on, and this is the
Mm,
70s, and it would be
mm,
like late at night, maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And I used to think, why the hell's this really old big band music on the radio? But it's because people who were 60 years old at that point, when I was only 10, had
mm.
enjoyed big band music in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they were still just young enough to want to still listen to it. So BBC Radio 2 played it. So it's not a new phenomenon for people to cling on to their musical youth without bringing in that reggae band, obviously.
Well, actually, I'm surprised they're not on the bill. They're old enough as well, aren't they? They're not. They have to keep
Musical
renaming
pensioners.
themselves. They're certainly not musical youth anymore. So, would you
Mm.
go to a show, Graham? Would you go to a show like this?
It depends what the reports on how good they are is for a start. Depends if I've seen when they were young. I never go to see bands that I saw when they were in their prime. So the Buzzcocks, have not seen them live in person since 1978. Which is because why would you want to see the Buzzcocks 20, 30, 40 years later when you see them when they were young and
Mm,
really good? So I just don't do that sort of thing. If I've never seen the band before, like I saw the Who
yeah,
at Leeds Arena, but
yeah.
nearly 10 years ago now,
Mm.
that was great because I'd never really seen them. But yeah, I wouldn't go and see something I'd seen before in a sort of like older, not as good or not nearly as good version. But I know some people do, so who am I to knock them?
Well, I'm not. I'm okay. Well, I think we should not. I don't. I'm kind of contradicting myself on one level because I, like you, have been to see bands where I didn't have the chance to see them at their peak. And if that's happened, then later on, or there's a curiosity in trying to get a ticket for Pulp at the moment to go and see Jarvis perform at Scarborough. I'm on a waiting list for a press ticket. It's so in demand. I've actually already given out twice as many press tickets as was first planned, such as the desire to see this. But you can hardly call
Jarvis is still very good, though. You
and
can't knock
Jarvis is not
Jarvis.
exactly, and
Jarvis
I'm
is
not
still
knocking
quality.
pensionable age because I'm very near pensionable age myself. But I think there's a curiosity in seeing what Jarvis is, he does, and how he's still one of the great frontmen. And so I'm going to contradict myself by saying that I really would like to see that gig. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with being past your best. I mean, let's think who came to play at Garforth, the great was it the footballer, what was he called? He wasn't called Socrates. Maybe he was called Socrates. The Brazilian footballer who was the name
Yeah,
of
it
a
might have been.
philosopher.
Yeah, yeah, he's Brazilian. Yeah.
And he was about 45. And of course, he got a heavy
Hmm.
smoking. If he wasn't heavy smoking, forgive me, I don't want to be libeling him. And I haven't necessarily got his name right, but I think he was called Socrates. And of course, there was a curiosity in seeing him play. Um, at that age at Garforth Town. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment. I get that. Or even Brian Close playing Test cricket when he's 45, coming out. Or I think Colin Cowdrey came back into the England team as an older player.
Yeah,
And
but
there is a
Charles, you wouldn't have paid £150 to go and see Socrates not play very good football. And
no, I
when you go to
wouldn't.
see these old timer acts now in rock and pop, you're paying quite a
Yeah.
lot of money in general.
Well, you are, and actually, I'm glad you made that point, because that is part of the judgment that I think people now make. Uh, Going to concerts is becoming not prohibitively expensive, but it is. Glastonbury alone was what, 330 this year? I think
Yeah, well, that's
330 for Glastonbury tickets.
well, yeah. As Britain gets more unequal, and with the the problems with inflation and energy prices, etc., heaped on top of that, it
Mm,
is becoming a divided nation in terms of the arts. I mean, when I was a kid, almost anybody could afford to go and see a gig of a band
mm,
that you'd heard of, read about in Enemy or Sounds, or seen
yeah,
on Top of the Pops. And now
yeah.
that isn't the case. There must be a lot of people in Britain who just can't afford to pay that sort of
Can't
money.
afford to go. No. And particularly when they're now doing this pricing system, some venues where if a show's selling well, they then actually put the price up for the remaining tickets, which makes it even more
Yeah,
difficult.
it's called dynamic pricing, which
Dynamic,
is
yeah,
a great
dynamic.
euphemism.
What a
So,
wonderful word to use. Dynamic.
yeah, yeah,
It's called rip-off in most language. Rip-off.
yeah, yeah,
That's what it is.
yeah,
But
exactly. Yeah,
it's all part of
yeah,
capitalism,
yeah.
Graham. That wonderful
Mm.
system that works so well. Now, Graham, before we finish, um, Martin Creed, we've both given
Yeah,
our
well, there's,
thoughts
mm.
on the exhibition, Harrogate, but you've actually, it's one
Well,
of
we
those
can't do that
I've met.
quickly,
Dot dot
Charles.
dot. So Martin Creed has met Graham. How did this happen and when?
Look, it was at Harriet's Mercer Gallery yesterday, and as well as watching him do his sort of surreal musical show, I then had 20 minutes just me and him chatting about things, and he was an exceedingly witty, likable, and very intelligent and very open, approachable, non-egotistical man. I don't think I've met anybody as famous as Martin Creed, because he did win the Turner Prize in 2021, in 2001, and he still has exhibitions, major exhibitions around the world. I haven't met anybody
Mm.
as famous as him. He was quite so nice, but also deeply intelligent. He was like as deep as Dylan Moran, but a lot more light-hearted. So it was a great meeting. It was like I knew I was the underdog in this meeting, even though he was nice. I thought there's no way I can be too clever here or be too smart, because he's going to see right through the whole show.
So this was in connection, obviously, with the ongoing exhibition at the Mercer Gallery. So Graham, I mean, he is as much a musician as an artist. So what this was always planned, this show, wasn't it? This was always one of the extras that came with Martin doing the exhibition in Harrogate. And you asked him questions on stage. You hosted him on stage.
No, no, it was an open audience with him,
Right.
and he's also a musician of a very surreal nature, and he
Yeah.
and he plays live gigs. He's had one album released, at least one album, many singles on respectable indie labels as well. So he is
Hmm.
a live performer, and if you imagine him as Billy Connolly, except a surrealist, you're pretty close to him. He's actually a very good stand-up comic, even though the show he does is designed to look like he's shambolic and he's like a bit sort of like loose, but it's not.
Did
He's
he
actually,
remind you of?
actually
Did he
very
remind you of Ivor Cutler?
well. Yeah, I mentioned that to him afterwards, and he went, "Yeah, I love Ivor Cutler."
I thought he might.
He's a bit like if Jonathan Richman loved Ivor Cutler, you've got Martin Creed as a musician.
Hmm. I'm going to ask Graham, did you prefer his music to his art?
I like both. He's a very entertaining man, so his art's entertaining and quite easy to grasp, and so
Yes.
is his show. He's
Mm.
you basically, I mean, I think he has played Edinburgh Fringe, but
Yeah, must have done. Must have done.
if he wasn't an artist, he would be a hit comedian. He would
Mm.
definitely work as a comedian, stand-up comic, without
Mm.
doubt. So I enjoyed them both, but I understood his art better by chatting to him, by seeing him perform, because he basically is a positive-natured man who wants to bring some intelligent joy to the world, which is again is quite rare for a major artist.
It is. So was it well attended, Graham?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a small room, but it was full up. I mean, you got to remember this
Mm.
is Harrogate, and despite the fact I'm always saying that Harrogate is a much more interesting place than everybody thinks, there is
Mm.
still a fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned,
Yeah.
stuck in
Yeah.
the ways aspect to Harrogate, which I would never deny. And so for
No.
the Mercer to put on this exhibition and have Martin Creed there is a major coup. This is the sort of thing you normally only get in London or Glasgow or
Exactly.
Manchester or New York or
Did
Paris.
he?
So Harrogate is
Yeah.
Mercer Gall's done a great job there.
Did he perform amongst all those balls?
No, the balls were next door because the balls is a lot off the balls. As you know, there's like 900 balls.
So which room was he in? Which room was he in?
He's in a room with that fantastic wallpaper. It's really colourful, well-designed
Okay.
wallpaper,
Yes.
slightly
Yes.
surreal. So it was a good
Yeah.
setting.
Did he wear his paint-splattered suit? Last question before time runs out.
He wore a sort of 3D suit with bits hanging out of it. He had darts.
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic sub-production.